Well, last week I wasn't sure if I was finished with my playlist series, but this week there was a song that kind of resonated with me, and I'm probably going to preach one of the simplest, most basic playlist songs ever. Probably a song everyone knows and we've sung 10,000 times. But sometimes in simplicity, there's something very powerful and profound. I want to recall that the reason we're doing this whole series is we want to be what Jesus called us to be. A time is coming and has now come when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For they're the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the spirit and in truth. You know, the simple song that we're going to do today is Amazing Grace. And recall the title is not just Grace, but Amazing Grace. And I know, I've used this illustration before, but sometimes I feel it's appropriate to the things of God. At times we become so conditioned to the things around us, we can become numb or used to the mess or smells that are around us. I remember when we moved to western Nebraska, you'd go driving by a feedlot and you'd see a house next to that feedlot. And in our car, we could hardly contain our disgust at the smell, yet there's someone who lives there every day. The smell that was so shocking to us was so normal to them. It's kind of like when you see an older person who's got an injury or a pain and they seem to have adapted to the pain. I recognize that if I had the same pain that they had, I would whine like a baby, but they go on and do life. Sometimes we become conditioned not just to the bad things, but the good things. I grew up in Kentucky and beef came from the grocery store. A steak, it was a piece of meat that sometimes could be considered steak, and sometimes I wondered if they spelled it differently so they could call it steak, you know what I'm saying? And then we moved to western Nebraska in a place where beef is plentiful and it's good beef. When family comes to visit us, I cook them a steak, and several times I've heard this is the best steak I've had in my life, and it's not because I'm such a good cook, it's because the beef is so good. But my kids, all but one, they could care less for the beef. Why? Because it's what they're used to. My wife, she's a gifted vocalist, and I get to hear her sing all the time. And it's not that she's not incredibly gifted, but I don't always appreciate her singing quite like other people do. Why? Because I hear it so often. Sights, sounds, tastes, conditions. Sometimes we can neglect to realize how amazing the things are around us. Today's message, I want to highlight grace. God's grace is something that the first time we experienced it, it brought most of us to our knees. Our entire world was changed and transformed in an instant. But over time, the grace is still the same. It just doesn't seem so amazing because we become conditioned or numb to the revelation of grace in our lives. What is grace? In my study Bible, it explained it this way. Justice is getting what we deserve. Mercy is not getting what we deserve. And grace is getting what we don't deserve. In Bible school, you are taught grace. It's this definition, unmerited favor. Favor that you shouldn't have, but you get. So what is amazing grace? I find amazing grace in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent or of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me.'" Out of his fullness, we've all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. What is amazing grace? In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. That's in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus came full of grace and truth. And so through him, we were given an undeserved gift, the right to become children of God. Amazing grace is the undeserved gift that God has revealed through his Son, Jesus Christ. It's the gift of salvation. We see it described in Ephesians by Paul. As for you, you were dead in your transgression and sins, in the way in which you used to live when you followed the ways of the world and the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath, but because of God's great love for us, who is rich in mercy, he made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgression. It's by grace you've been saved, and God raised us up with Christ, seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus, in order that in the coming ages he might show the incomparable riches of his grace expressed in his kindness to us in Jesus Christ. For it's by grace you've been saved through faith. This is not of yourselves, it's the gift of God. Not by works, so that no one can boast. For we're God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do the good works which God prepared for in advance for us to do. God's amazing grace. We all sinned. We all deserved the wrath of God, but we were saved by grace. We were elevated to a position with Jesus Christ in the heavenly realms, and the incomparable riches of his grace, the amazing grace of God has been revealed to us through Jesus Christ, not by works. Sometimes we need to recognize grace set us free from sin, and sometimes we need to realize that grace set us free from religion. Grace is the free gift of God that I did not deserve, that called me a joint heir with Jesus Christ. But grace is also the means of my salvation today. It's not by my works. It's not by my efforts. I can't do enough to earn what God has freely given me. He gets all the credit. That's amazing grace. Just a little bit of the story of the guy who wrote this hymn. John Newton, he lived in about 1725 in London, England. He was born and he had a mom and a dad. His mom was a devout Christian. His dad was a sailor. His mom spent time imparting the truth in him, but about the age of 7, his mom died of tuberculosis. And so he was left to be raised by his dad and stepmom. About the age of 11, his dad said, "Hey, you're going to come on the ship with me." A great place to raise a kid. I read something that said he only went to 2 days of school. Everything John Newton knew, he was taught himself. But he spent over 5 trips with his dad on the boat up until about the age of 17. Age 18, his dad tried to set up John for life, and he got him a position in Jamaica running a slave plantation. But the issue was John fell in love with a girl, and he missed the day of the boat to go. And so his dad was very upset with him, and he forced him to join the Royal Navy himself. John was not the best shipman. He didn't get along with the others. He was humiliated and flogged by the Navy for not coming back to the boat in time. His life was in shambles. He quit. He ended up getting on a slave trade ship himself. He made the crew of that ship so upset with him that they abandoned him on an island. When he was abandoned, he actually became a slave while he was on that island. He was treated so poorly on that island that the other slaves gave him rations of their food just to help him live. In the midst of his brokenness, there was a captain who recognized him because of his relationship with John's dad, and he brought him out of slavery and started to take him back to England. His story goes that while they were on the way back to England, there was a ferocious storm on the sea. In the midst of that storm, John was called to the deck, and as he was coming up the ladder, the captain asked him to get a knife, and the guy that went up the ladder in his place was taken off the ship and died. John came up and he was asked to take the helm of the ship, and the storm was beating, it was blowing, everything was going crazy. And in the midst of that moment, John cried out for God's mercy in his life. And God changed him. He delivered him. He brought him back to England safely. Eventually, after several years, he became a pastor in England. When he became a pastor, the first time he applied to be ordained, he was denied. The second time he became a pastor in a small town, his congregation continued to grow. And one thing he did with his congregation was he would consistently, on a Sunday night, write a hymn for the church to focus on. In one of those hymns, written some 40 or 50 years later, was this amazing grace. Maybe 30 years. Amazing grace. He wrote these words, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to feel, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home. One thing I read about John Newton was every March 21st, he had a day that he called a day of humiliation, prayer, and praise. It was a day that he was intentional about recognizing the amazing grace of God. In your life, have you become conditioned to the good, the amazing grace that God has revealed? I encourage you to stop and think, what has God given you freely? You didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it, but he gave it. The Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you, be gracious to you, may turn his face towards you, grant you his peace, and may you know God's amazing grace. Be blessed.